Imagine sitting in a small, dimly lit church. The scent of old wood and wax candles fills the air. People are hunched over in pews, dabbing their eyes with tisk. The sound of muffled sobs mixes with the organ's low hum. Everyone is there to mourn a woman they loved, a woman believed to be gone forever. The casket rests at the front, heavy with flowers, and the tension in the room clings like fog. Then the doors creak open. A shadow crosses the threshold. Gasps echo through the church because the woman they came to bury is standing right there, alive, staring back at them. This is not the plot of a horror film. This is something that actually happened. And the story behind it, it's even stranger, darker, and more disturbing than you'd expect. It always begins quietly, so quietly, that no one notices the shift until it's already too late. A chair left empty at the dinner table, a bed unrumpled, the familiar sound of footsteps absent from the hallway. At first, it feels like nothing at all, just a delay, an errand that took longer than expected, a phone call missed. Life continues as though nothing is wrong, but beneath the surface, unease begins to coil. Hours slip by, then a day, and still there is no sign, no message, no explanation. The mind invents excuses at first, because hope is always louder than dread. Perhaps a sudden trip, perhaps time alone, perhaps anything other than the possibility that something darker has taken hold. But hope can only stretch so far before it begins to thin and tear. And once it tears, the silence becomes unbearable. The silence. That's the cruelest part. It's not just the absence of sound, but the presence of questions, swelling and multiplying in every corner of the room. Where could she be? Why hasn't she returned? Why hasn't she called? And soon those questions become monsters in the dark, gnawing at the edges of sleep, growing heavier with every passing hour. Days pass. People whisper. The absence becomes a presence all its own, a ghost that lingers over every gathering, a shadow that flickers at the edge of every light. In small places where everyone knows each other's habits, the missing are never truly gone at first. Every street corner seems to hold the memory of them. The market stall, the worn path to the church, the faint laughter once carried on the window of it lingers, demanding explanation. At first, those left behind cling to optimism, repeating that she will return. She must return. They tell themselves that bad things don't happen here, not in this place, not to them. But that comforting lie begins to crumble as time refuses to give back what it has stolen. Rumors sprout quickly in soil watered by fear. Some murmur that she simply ran away, tired of the weight of her life, unwilling to remain tethered. Others whisper darker things, their voices lowering to nearly nothing when the speculation turns to foul play. Two dangers lurking closer than anyone wants to believe. And yet, no matter the theory, no one can silence the knowing truth. No one has seen her. No one has heard her voice. The trail, if there ever was one, has gone cold. History is littered with vanishings that leave scars across time. Each disappearance carving out a hollow space where certainty should be. The sea once swallowed ships whole, leaving families to search horizons that never gave back their loved ones. Remote roads have taken travelers, their belongings found years later, rusted and covered in dust. And behind each of those stories, there was the same haunting pause, the same slow dawning realization that absence does not always explain itself. This moment, too, was no different. The strangest part was how quickly the absence became routine. After weeks of waiting, after questions turned into empty echoes, people adjusted in a way that felt unnatural. Life moved forward, but crookedly, like a picture frame hanging just slightly askew on a wall. There were no sightings, no messages scrawled on scraps of paper, no belongings discovered in a place they shouldn't be, just void. And in that void, the human mind does what it always does. It fills the emptiness with stories of accidents, of predators, of desperate escapes. Stories told in hushed voices, growing more elaborate as they pass from ear to ear, until they no longer feel like stories but inevitabilities. She must be gone. She must be dead. Nothing else could explain the silence, the unnatural vanishing of someone who once breathed and moved and laughed. And so, slowly, death was accepted not with proof, but with exhaustion. People cannot hold on to uncertainty forever. It corrodes them from the inside out. To believe in death, even without evidence, feels easier than clinging to the endless ache of not knowing. It offers finality, a way to place grief into a box and label it. Without that, grief has no walls. It seeps into everything, staining every conversation, every glance at an empty chair. Believing she was gone allowed people to breathe again, even if the breath was shallow, even if it caught in their throats. But what makes this so unsettling, what keeps it from becoming just another tragedy, is how thin the line was between assumption and reality. In villages long ago, they feared this line so much, they built safeguards against it. Coffins fitted with bells that could be rung from the inside, graveyards where the earth was shallow enough to dig through if necessary, rules that demanded bodies be watched 4 days before burial. They understood the horror of being wrong, of mistaking silence for finality. The fear of burying someone still alive wasn't superstition, it was the acknowledgement of how fragile certainty can be. Here, too, certainty was fragile. The absence was never confirmed by proof, only by weariness. It is easier to grieve than to endure hope that may never be fulfilled. Easier to bow to the weight of what feels inevitable than to continue clawing at shadows. And so, the community embraced its own illusion, convinced themselves that the missing were lost, that the void was filled by something solid, when in truth it remained hollow all along. Yet even in their mourning, unease persisted. Some could not shake the feeling that the story was unfinished, that this silence was not the end, but the beginning of something else. They carried that unease like a secret tucked away in the folds of their clothing, whispered into the darkness when they thought no one could hear. And it is in that secret unease, in that thin crack between assumption and truth, that the real terror began to fester. Because disappearance is never just about absence. It's about the way absence infects the living, about how the human mind twists and bends to make sense of the senseless. It's about the slow acceptance of death without the comfort of a body, without the mercy of certainty. And deep down, even as they told themselves they were sure, they knew they weren't. They knew the silence was not proof. They knew absence alone cannot seal a fate. And yet, they buried her in their minds, carved her name into memory as though into stone, and called it closure. But closure built on assumption is fragile, breakable with a single knock on a door, a single shadow in a doorway. And when that shadow came, when the silence broke, it did not just unravel their grief, it unraveled their trust in what is real, in what can be believed, in how thin the veil between life and death truly is. The day of the funeral began not with the blare of tragedy, but with a hush that seemed to swallow the air. The streets were muted, as though the town itself held its breath. The morning light was pale and reluctant, leaking through clouds that pressed low against the rooftops. Every step toward the church carried a weight, the shuffle of shoes on cobblestones sounding too loud, too final. People walked slowly, as though dragged forward by duty rather than will, their black coats and veils blurring into a procession of shadows. Inside, the air was thick, heavy with the scent of lilies and wax. Flowers that should have symbolized life and beauty became suffocating, their sweetness clinging to throats already tight with grief. Candles flickered against the stone walls, throwing long, restless shapes that danced like restless spirits. The space, though familiar, felt altered sacred, but also sinister, as if the walls themselves leaned inward to listen. Every cough, every muffled sob seemed to echo too loudly in the cavernous silence. The coffin lay at the front, shrouded in fabric and flowers, a centerpiece of sorrow. No one dared look at it for too long, as though staring might bring acknowledgement too sharp to endure. Closed, sealed, it denied anyone the comfort of a final glimpse, the undeniable confirmation that the body within belonged to the one they mourned. Yet no one questioned it aloud. To speak doubt at such a moment would be blasphemy, would unravel the fragile fabric holding the ceremony together. So they sat obedient to ritual and told themselves they were saying goodbye. The rituals themselves unfolded with a kind of grim choreography, movements honed over centuries of grief. Words were read in tones that trembled between solemnity and wariness, the rhythm slow and deliberate, stretching seconds into eternities. Each phrase pronounced death as certainty, each prayer urged acceptance. Yet, beneath the recitation, a tension coiled and unease no one dared name. It was not just sorrow that filled the air, it was something heavier, something unspoken, a suspicion too dangerous to bring into light. Grief does not move cleanly. It tangles and twists. And in that room it showed in every face. Some wept openly, shoulders shaking, eyes redrimmed and swollen. Others stared straight ahead, rigid, their pain locked deep inside where no one could see. Children fidgeted, not fully understanding why the air felt so heavy, why whispers turned sharp when they grew restless. And then there were those who seemed distant, their gazes unfocused, as though the ceremony were a play they had been forced to watch again and again, waiting for the end that never felt satisfying. Every sound carried weight. The scrape of a pew, the crumple of tissue, the shuddering exhale of someone who could no longer contain themselves. The organ's low hum filled the gaps. its notes vibrating through the floor, through bone, through marrow, as if even the music itself wanted to remind everyone that endings are irreversible. The sound lingered long after each chord was struck, vibrating like an echo in the chest. Yet still, despite the ritual, despite the words spoken and the tears shed, there lingered a strange dissonance. It was as though the ceremony were too smooth, too controlled, lacking the rough edges of reality. Some stole glances at one another, searching for confirmation of this feeling, but finding only downcast eyes. They clung to the ritual because without it, they would be forced to confront the cracks in the story. A body unseen, a disappearance to neat, a conclusion reached without proof. But funerals are not designed for questions. Funerals are designed to quiet them. Outside the stained glass, the sky shifted, clouds rolling darker, shadows bending across the floor like fingers stretching toward the coffin. Each beam of colored light painted faces in fractured shades of crimson and blue, as though marking them with grief they could never wash away. The air grew colder, though no one moved to acknowledge it. Some shifted in their seats, rubbing their arms, though the chill seemed to come from within rather than from the draft. And then came the moment designed to seal everything, the pause when silence is demanded, when everyone bows their head at once, as though submission itself might keep the dead at peace. It was a silence too loud, ringing in ears, making hearts pound harder, as if the body within the coffin were listening, waiting, holding its breath with them. In that silence, imaginations ran wild. Was she really lying there, cold and still? Was the coffin truly filled, or was it only a symbol, a vessel of lies cloaked in flowers and velvet? No one dared to ask, but the question seeped into the silence, becoming part of the atmosphere. Pressing down on every chest like a weight. History has seen funerals like this before, where rituals masked unease, where the community clung to ceremony as a shield against doubt. In centuries past, it was not uncommon for the dead to stir again, for mourners to discover they had buried not corpses but sleepers. Safeguards were born of those terrors, contraptions to ring bells from beneath the earth. The memory of those mistakes lingered unspoken, a reminder that what is buried is not always gone, and what is mourned may not be lost. Perhaps some in that room carried those memories in their blood, feeling their unease sharpen with each word spoken. The ceremony drew onward, each moment dripping like wax, slow and deliberate. People rose, shuffled forward to lay flowers, their movements stiff, mechanical. Each bloom fell like a weight, the fragrance layering, suffocating, as though trying to smother whatever truth lay beneath. One by one, they turned away, eyes averted, hands clenched tight as if gripping the fragile belief that this was the end. But beneath the ritual, beneath the incense and the prayers, the truth remained unsettled. No coffin, no ritual, no chant could erase the fact that this was a burial built on assumption, and that made the ceremony less of a farewell and more of a performance, staged to satisfy the human need for closure. As the organ swelled once more and the final words were spoken, the atmosphere thickened with finality. The congregation prepared themselves to leave their bodies aching from the weight of sorrow carried too long. Yet, as they rose and filed out, their footsteps heavy on the stone floor, there was a tension that clung to them like mist. No one dared say it aloud, but the feeling was there that this ending was not complete. That the coffin did not close the story, that something remained unfinished, waiting to rise. And as the doors of the church swung open and the outside air rushed in, that unspoken truth lingered, a phantom walking among them. They thought they had witnessed an ending, but endings are fragile things. Sometimes they crack, sometimes they shatter, and sometimes, when you least expect it, the dead themselves come to reclaim the story. The silence was absolute. It pressed down on the mourners like a heavy hand, each breath stifled by the weight of finality. The last note of the organ had faded into nothing, leaving only the faint rustle of fabric and the distant creak of the old wooden beams above. Eyes were lowered, heads bowed, the ceremony nearing its end. This was the moment when grief should have hardened into acceptance, when ritual promised closure, but then a sound cut through the stillness. It was small at first, barely noticed. A hinge groaning metal scraping against wood, the sound of a door opening slowly, reluctantly, as though protesting. Heads lifted one by one, confusion knitting. Brows. No one was expected. No one should have disturbed this sacred silence. Yet the noise grew, echoing across the chamber, bouncing against stone walls, until there was no denying it. The great doors had shifted. A draft followed, curling through the aisles, brushing against the back of next. It was colder than the air within, sharp enough to raise. Candles flickered, their flames bowing low, shadows stretching tall and strange against the walls. For a heartbeat, the congregation froze, caught in that suspended moment between knowing something was wrong and daring to face what it might be. And then came the figure. At first, it was only a shape outlined in the light spilling from the doorway, a silhouette carved against the gray of the day outside. The steps were slow, deliberate, heels clicking faintly against the stone floor. With every step forward, the shape grew clearer, and gasps rippled through the crowd like a sudden storm across still water. Eyes widened, hands clutched at mouths, and disbelief turned quickly to fear. It was her. The woman for whom they had gathered. The one they believed lay silent and cold inside the coffin at the front of the room, now stood alive in the doorway, how form undeni of her presence undeniable. Her face was pale, but not with death pale, with the strange emptiness of someone who has walked too long in the shadows. Her eyes scanned the crowd, and those eyes alone unraveled every thread of certainty. They were not clouded, not unseeing, but bright, alive, and unbearably aware. The room erupted. Some cried out in horror, stumbling backward, crossing themselves, whispering prayers through trembling lips. Others surged forward as if to touch her, to prove she was real. A few simply sat frozen, unable to process the fracture of reality before them. The coffin stood heavy at the altar, the flowers arranged carefully above it, a monument to her supposed death. Yet here she was, her presence making a mockery of the entire ritual. The sound of her footsteps grew louder as she moved further inside, each step like a drumbeat, echoing through the silence that struggled to return. I faltered. Every breath hitched. There was no speech, no explanation spilling from her lips, just silence, as if she had let the fact of her existence be the only proof needed. And in that silence, a dreadful question pulsed in every mind. If she is here, alive, then who or what rests inside the coffin? The coffin became unbearable to look at. It seemed suddenly sinister, not a vessel of closure, but a container of secrets. What lay within it? Was it empty? Was it filled with a body that did not belong to her? Had grief blinded them all so completely that no one had dared to demand certainty? The coffin, once the center of mourning, became a threat. Panic swelled. Like a tide, a woman screamed and collapsed into the arms of those beside her. A man shouted for answers, his voice breaking, echoing off the stone. Some stumbled toward the exit, desperate to escape the unholy contradiction in front of them. Others remained transfixed, unable to look away from the figure walking steadily down the aisle toward the very place her supposed body was meant to rest. The air grew heavier with every step she took. The fragrance of flowers seemed cloying now, oppressive, as if trying to smother the truth that had forced its way into the room. The flames of the candles sputtered, their light shrinking, leaving faces half hidden in shadow. The walls, once comforting in their solidity, now loomed like a tomb, sealing everyone in with the impossible. And yet, not all fear was aimed at her. Some eyes darted instead toward the coffin itself, as though expecting it to move, to open, to reveal some horror that had been mistaken for her. The imagination, once loosened, is a cruel master. Whispers hissed through the crowd, words like ghost and spirit, prayers mingled with curses, for in that moment, reality itself seemed fractured. If the dead could rise, if the grave could be denied, what else might follow? Her expression revealed nothing. Not sorrow, not joy, not anger, only the strange, detached calm of someone who has crossed through something unspeakable and returned changed. She reached the front of the room, her gaze falling at last on the coffin. For a breathless moment, she stood there, alive in the place of death, the living shadow of the one they believed gone forever. The air vibrated with tension, every heart pounding, every body rigid with dread. The sight of her standing there broke something inside the room. This was not relief. This was not the joyous return of someone thought lost. It was terror, raw and primal, because it demanded a rewriting of everything they had just mourned. Their grief had been wasted, their prayers misplaced. They had buried her in their minds, carved her memory into stone, only to watch her walk back into the room and shatter it all with her very presence. There are few things more frightening than realizing certainty is fragile. The certainty of death, of endings, of rituals meant to keep chaos at bay. And here she was, an embodiment of that fracture. Proof that the line between life and death was not only thin, but porous. The murmurs swelled into chaos. Questions flew like arrows. Where had she been? What had happened? Why had she stayed away? What lay inside the coffin? But she offered no answers. Her silence was worse than any confession could have been. Silence left room for the imagination. And the imagination is always crueler than truth. And so The congregation remained trapped in that moment, hovering between fear and awe, between faith and doubt. The coffin no longer offered closure, the ceremony no longer offered peace. The return of the living had poisoned the ritual of death. The sound of her breathing joined the air. Undeniable, steady, real, and yet, no matter how real she appeared, the question lingered like a curse. What had walked into the room that day? A woman reclaimed from shadows, a trick of fate, or something far more unnatural, something that wore her face but belonged to a realm no living soul was meant to touch. The answer never came. Only her presence, chilling and undeniable, alive in the place of death, leaving everyone in that room forever altered, forever haunted by the memory of the day the dead returned to stand among the living. The moment of her return should have been enough to silence every doubt, to drown the room in awe, to turn grief into celebration. But instead, it opened a chasm. Her presence was undeniable. She was alive, standing there before them but her. Silence, her unflinching gaze, carried something darker than relief. And from that silence, questions spilled like cracks across glass. How could she be here? Where had she gone? Who had deceived them into mourning a woman who had not died? The truth, when it began to surface, did not come in a single revelation, but in fragments, whispered confessions, uneasy discoveries, like a body rising from murky waters. Each piece floated upward in its own time, distorted, bloated, grotesque. And with every new detail, the story shifted from miracle to nightmare. At first, it seemed like a simple mistake, misidentification, confusion, the chaos of absence shaping grief into certainty. Perhaps the coffin held the body of another, someone, nameless, someone whose life had ended without recognition. But that explanation frayed quickly, unraveling under the weight of too many inconsistencies. Why had the coffin been closed so quickly, sealed without question? Why had no one demanded to see her, to lay eyes upon the body they buried? Why had they allowed words and ritual to stand in for proof? It was then the whispers sharpened into accusations. Someone had orchestrated this. Someone had decided to craft a death where none had existed. Whether out of malice or calculation, the ceremony had been staged to bury more than a person it was meant to bury: the truth. Deception, once suspected, poisoned everything. Every memory of her disappearance now seemed suspect. Had she truly vanished without trace, or had her absence been manufactured? Every kind gesture, every tear shed at the funeral, became tainted by the possibility of manipulation. People began to look at one another with suspicion, eyes narrowed, hands tightening unfolded arms, each face suddenly capable of lies. The betrayal was not hers alone. It was shared by all who had chosen to believe too easily, to surrender to. A narrative whispered to them rather than demand the weight of evidence. And what of her? She gave no explanation. Her lips parted only to breathe, her silence as deliberate as the deception that had preceded her. Yet her eyes betrayed her, flickering with something heavy, something unspeakable. They were not the eyes of someone who had simply wandered home. They were the eyes of someone who had seen too much, endured too much. Someone who carried knowledge that could unmake those around her if ever spoken aloud. The deception was not abstract. It had shape, it had motive, it had hands that had arranged. The coffin sealed the lid, spread the word of death. To bury a living person in memory requires intent, and intent carries with it a darkness few dare to confront. Why would anyone craft such a lie to erase her, to profit from her absence, to protect a secret so vile that death seemed easier than explanation? History is littered with betrayals like this, moments when lies replaced lives, a child stolen and replaced with another, a soldier reported dead while living in exile, identities forged, deaths faked, bodies. Each deception fractures families, splinters communities, because betrayal at this level is not just about one person, it infects everyone who believed. And here, too, the infection spread. No one could trust their own memories, their own grief. The betrayal had rewritten reality itself. The coffin at the front of the room became unbearable to look at. What lay inside was not just a body, was a symbol of the lie, the vessel of deception that had forced everyone to grieve a phantom. Some imagined it empty, filled only with rocks and fabric. Others feared it, held the body of another woman, unnamed, discarded, used as a prop in a cruel performance. And worst of all was the possibility that the coffin had been filled with nothing at all, that the entire ritual had been an elaborate stage set meant to condition them into acceptance that the betrayal, once recognized, could not be undone. Tears shed at the funeral became shame. Prayers whispered into the air became curses upon the lips. Even love itself, the raw mourning for her absence, felt manipulated. They had been tricked into carrying the weight of her death, only to find themselves mocked by her return. And it was not her fault, not entirely. She had been made into the weapon of the lie, her silence wielded against those who longed for truth. But the silence also spoke. It hinted that the deception was deeper than anyone wanted to admit, that her absence had not been voluntary, that forces greater than her had woven this narrative of death. Perhaps she had been hidden away, kept in shadow, her return allowed only when the lie could no longer be sustained. Or perhaps she had chosen silence because speaking the truth would unravel something larger, something more dangerous than the betrayal already exposed. The atmosphere in the room changed with each passing second. What had begun as grief and then become horror now curdled into paranoia. Eyes darted to neighbors, friends, even family, searching for signs of guilt. Who had arranged the coffin? Who had spoken the first words of her death? Who had signed the papers, given the orders, whispered the lies that spread like roots through the town? Trust cracked and splintered. Every bond felt suspect. Even blood ties seemed brittle under the weight of such deception. And through it all, she stood still, a figure both alive and ghostly, her very existence a contradiction. Betrayal draped her shoulders like a cloak. She had not asked for it, but she carried it all the same. Her very presence was proof of the lie, and yet without words from her, no one could know its shape, its scope, its origin. That silence made her both victim and accomplice, innocent and guilty, salvation and damnation. The deception did more than twist the truth of her life. It twisted the perception of death itself. If a coffin could be filled with lies, if a funeral could be staged upon falsehoods, then death no longer held certainty. Endings no longer offered closure. The ground beneath their feet no longer promised stability. Everything they trusted could be fabricated, every ritual tainted. And once that realization seeped in, there was no going back. The betrayal would outlive the moment. It would seep into every whispered conversation, every glance at the coffin, every recollection of that day. Children would grow up remembering the time death lied to them. Families would fracture, friendships dissolve, alliances splinter, all because trust had been fed to the fire of deceit. The living woman and the silent coffin faced one another, symbols of life and death twisted together, neither offering peace. The room held its breath, waiting for an explanation that never came. And that absence of truth, that deliberate silence, was worse than any confession because it allowed the imagination to fester, to breed horrors larger than reality, to weave betrayals darker than the truth could ever be. The lie had been exposed, but the truth remained hidden. And in that gap, in that haunting silence, the betrayal gained its most terrifying power. It could be anything. The silence after her return did not bring relief. It was not the silence of peace, nor the hush of comfort after grief. It was the kind of silence that lingers like smoke in the air, acrid, clinging to the skin, impossible to wash away. People left the church with their heads low, their steps hurried, but the weight of what had happened followed them like a shadow that would not loosen its grip. The dead had been mourned, buried in memory, and then the dead had walked back among them. Nothing could make sense of that. Nothing could restore the fragile order that had been shattered that in the days that followed. The town moved with the stiffness of a body half frozen. Whispers replaced conversation, suspicion replaced sympathy. Doors that once stood open were closed. Windows shuttered earlier each night, as if darkness itself had become a threat. No one knew what to believe anymore. The rituals that had once offered certainty, rituals of mourning, burial, prayer, had been exposed as hollow, easily corrupted by lies, easily mocked by the impossible. And if death could not be trusted, then what could? She walked among them, but her presence no longer belonged to life as it once had. To see her on the street was to feel an ache in the stomach, a tightening in the throat. Some crossed to the other side when they spotted her, unwilling to pass too close. Others stared, wide-eyed, unable to look away, as though watching might somehow unravel the truth hidden in her silence. Children whispered about her in the corners, their voices trembling with both fear and fascination. They spoke of ghosts that refused to rest, of spirits trapped between worlds. Even when told to hush, their words carried weight, because in their innocence they spoke the thoughts everyone else was too afraid to name. She did not smile. She did not explain. She simply moved through the days as though she had stepped into a world that no longer fit her. Each motion was deliberate, each glance heavy, her eyes always seeming to hold back more than they revealed. When she passed, conversations stuttered into silence. When she entered a room, the atmosphere thickened, as though the walls leaned closer, listening for what she might say, but she said nothing. Her silence was more frightening than any story, because it left a void that others were forced to fill. Rumors multiplied like weeds. Some said she had been taken away and hidden, imprisoned in a place where light could not reach her, only to escape when the lie could no longer hold. Others insisted she had willingly abandoned them, choosing to disappear and return only when guilt gnawed at her enough to drag her back. Still, others whispered the darkest version that she had died indeed, but something had returned wearing her skin. Each theory was passed with trembling lips, each one gnawed at the fabric of trust until nothing remained untainted. The coffin, now empty of meaning, became the center of their nightmares. Some demanded it be opened, inspected, as if proof could cleanse the stain. Others refused, fearing what might be revealed if the lid was lifted. What if there was no body? What if there was another? What if what they found was worse than anything they had imagined? In the end, the coffin remained sealed, a symbol of their doubt, a locked chamber of unanswered questions. Every time they thought of it, they felt the same sick weight in their stomachs, as though death itself had become untrustworthy, a trickster playing games with their grief. Her family did not know how to touch her anymore. To embrace her felt wrong, as though they were clutching at a shadow. To speak to her was unbearable, because her replies, if they came at all, were brief, quiet, spoken in a voice that sounded familiar yet distant, touched by something colder. She sat among them, but she was apart, her very existence a reminder of the rupture between what they believed and what was true. She had become a living contradiction, a walking wound in the heart of the community. And then there were the nights. Some swore they heard her moving through the streets after dark, her steps echoing on the cobblestones long after others had gone to bed. Others claimed her shadow passed their windows when no one was outside. A few said they woke in the dead of night to see her standing at the edge of the trees, watching, unmoving, her pale face catching the moonlight before vanishing back into the dark. No one could prove it. No one dared confront her. But the stories grew, carrying the weight of truth simply because they echoed the fear already nesting in every mind. Time did not dull the unease. Instead, it sharpened it. Weeks stretched into months, and still she remained silent, alive, but never truly present. Every glance at her was a reminder of the lie, of the betrayal, of the way certainty had shattered that day in the church. She became less a woman and more a symbol, an omen of everything unstable, everything unknowable. To some, she was a ghost walking in daylight. To others, she was a curse. To herself, no one could say, because she never offered the words to explain. What was most haunting was how ordinary life tried to wrap itself around her return. Markets opened, bells rang, seasons shifted. But beneath it all was the fracture, the unspoken truth that nothing was ordinary anymore. Every laugh, every prayer, every gathering carried with it the shadow of her presence. She did not need to speak to haunt them. She only needed to exist, and in that existence lay the deepest terror. For if death could be undone, even once, even by accident, then how safe was anyone? If grief could be manipulated, if rituals could be lies, then how could anyone trust the ground beneath their feet, the air in their lungs, the certainty of the last breath? She was not only a woman who had returned, she was proof that death itself could be mocked, that the boundary between the living and the dead was not as solid as they had believed. The betrayal had cracked their trust. but her presence ensured it would never heal. She became a permanent question, one that followed them through their days and into their dreams. Every time she passed by, people flinched not from her, but from what she represented. She was no longer flesh and blood, no longer simply alive. She was a ghost that still walked, a reminder that nothing, not even death, could be trusted. And so she remained haunting, not with wails or chains, but with silence, with eyes that had seen too much, with a life that should have ended but did not. Her every breath was a wound to their certainty, her every step a shadow on their faith. The coffin still stood sealed, a monument to lie. But she was the greater monument, the living proof of a truth too frightening to speak. She was alive, yes, but in their hearts, in their minds, she was more ghost than woman. And ghosts do not simply vanish. They linger, they consume, they remind you, with every shiver down your spine, that the dead do not always stay dead.